Jacob Fronczak here with First Fruits of Zion, and today we're going to be trying a new kind of content for the channel. We're going to be doing a reaction video, and today I'm going to be reacting to a debate between philosopher and theologian William Lane Craig and political commentator and talk show host Ben Shapiro. And they're going to be talking about whether Jesus is the Messiah. And we have strong opinions at First Fruits of Zion as to whether Jesus is the Messiah. So let's jump right in and see what they have to say.
Okay. So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets. And
yeah, that's important because Son of God can just mean a Jewish king. Like when the Psalm, the Psalm, like Psalm 2 or whatever, where it says, "Oh, you're my son." That psalm's not just about Jesus. The coronation psalms and such were used of any king. They were written for Solomon or whoever. They were also called like the Son of God. So he added that phrase in a unique sense to indicate maybe like a Trinitarian identity or something like that.
That he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had...
Yeah, and that's a very different thing. It's weird that Son of God can be a title for any Jewish king, but Son of Man in Daniel is this supernal figure. I find that interesting.
This radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15.
Sort of. You had some Sanhedrin there. According to Jewish law, the Sanhedrin meets in the room of hewn stone in the temple. Doesn't meet in like Caiaphas's basement or wherever they were, So there were people there from the Sanhedrin. It doesn't appear to have been a formal meeting of the Sanhedrin under Jewish law. It doesn't appear that they followed the rules for conducting a capital case. It's sort of like if 5 of the Supreme Court justices met together at the Chief Justice's house and made a decision. Like, was it the Supreme Court? Oh, yes. But actually, no.
All 3 of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" That is the Son of God. And Jesus,
that means King of Israel. And in this, that's what he's asking when he asks the question.
Jesus says, "I am," and then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?"
Because of the Son of Man thing, probably.
And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition.
Yeah, that's important. The Romans didn't care if you thought you had some kind of divine identity. I mean, Paul goes into a city once, and the people start thinking he's an incarnation of a god. Remember in Acts? But yeah, the Romans would care if you were going to try to peel off one of their colonies. So that political identity of the Messiah, the king of the Jewish people, the king of the Jews, that's what the Romans would have cared about. They didn't want any kings of the Jews popping up, starting some kind of a resistance movement against their occupation.
And crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense. Even that.
Yeah, imagine if it were. Imagine if it were against Jewish law to be the Messiah. That would get complicated when the Messiah actually came. So yeah, Ben is correct.
There are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves Messianic figures.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's true. Back in like the 130s. I don't know if it was so important that Bar Kokhba thought he was the Messiah. The important thing is Rabbi Akiva thought he was the Messiah. But yeah, Ben is right here too.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But
that is what Jesus has to do. Jesus has to do those things to be the Messiah. I disagree with Ben that Jesus had this radically different self-conception than the traditional Jewish expectations of the Messiah, that he's going to do all those things that Ben just said. He does have to do that. Jesus has to come back and like reconstitute the kingdom of Israel and fulfill normative Jewish messianic expectations. Normative Jewish messianic expectations aren't made up. They're just all the things that God said in the Old Testament through the prophets that the Messiah has to do. If Jesus doesn't do those things, he's not the Messiah. That's part of what it means to like have faith. Like when the apostles talk about having faith in Jesus, they saw him after he came back from the dead. They didn't have to like trust someone else telling them that happened. What they have to have faith for is that he's going to come back and he's going to fulfill all of the prophecies about what the Messiah is supposed to do. He has to do that. He has to do that or he's not the Messiah. You have to believe in the second coming. So I disagree that Jesus came to be something different than the traditional Jewish Messiah. He might have added on to it. He might have done some other things that maybe weren't expected, but he still has to do all the other stuff. He has to reconstitute the kingdom of Israel, rebuild the temple, regather the exiles. He has to do that.
The idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, I am God, which would be a much more punishable offense. Presumably that would be actual blasphemy. That
only if it's not true. I mean, I think Visegrad might agree with me. That's only blasphemy if it's not true. You can't say that God can't show up like through a person or in a person or in a way that you could see and interact with him, or that he could grant his word or his logos like a divine identity incarnated in a human being. You can't say that God can't do that. God can do whatever he wants. I understand like why he's reluctant to believe that happened, because everyone else who has claimed that kind of identity has been a liar. But it's not that it can't happen. It's not that it's automatically blasphemy. It's only blasphemy if it's incorrect, and we think it's correct. So.
It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And
no, the one thing they agree on is the one thing that they're wrong about, or that I disagree with them about. Yeah. First of all, it's very difficult to say what Jewish messianic expectations were among the common people or the chief priests, because the Sadducees didn't leave behind any writing, and neither did the average person, at least not much. I think actually some of the best material we have as far as assessing first century Jewish expectations of the Messiah is in the New Testament, Because you could see people ask Jesus questions like, are you going to bring the kingdom to Israel at this time? Like in Acts chapter 1. But, when the disciples ask, are you going to bring the kingdom to Israel at this time? He didn't say, oh, you misunderstood. Like sometimes he says that, right? Sometimes he says stuff like, have you not been with me all this time and you still don't get it? Like, haven't you been listening? He doesn't say that in Acts chapter 1. He says, it's not for you to know the times, right? So it's like, okay, it's going to happen. I just can't tell you when it's going to happen. They would have freaked out if you told them they were going to have to wait this long. So Jesus didn't come to erase the Old Testament prophets and all the things that they said the Messiah had to do. If that were allowed, anyone could do it. If you're allowed to just show up and say, oh, by the way, everything God said before, don't worry about that. We're gonna completely get rid of it or completely misinterpret it. Like, why not just convert to Islam? Maybe Muhammad was right when he said the same thing. It's like a white van comes to pick you up at school and you're 10 years old and some stranger says, get in the back. Like, your parents are in the hospital. How do you know that guy's kosher? How do you know that you should get in the van? Well, you would have to have something prearranged. Your parents would have to could give you like a code word or something, right? You don't just get into somebody's van, right? You don't just believe someone that comes along and says, God sent me. There's like a whole system to verify whether such a person is actually from God, and that's all in Deuteronomy. There's the test of the false prophet. You cannot show up and say, I'm the Messiah, and by the way, the Messiah is something completely different. That system would be too easy to break. So, again, hard disagree.
Didn't meet their expectations. Indeed,
not yet.
That's what helped to get him crucified.
No, if he would have met their expectations and tried to reestablish an independent kingdom of Israel in the land of Israel, that would have got him crucified a lot faster.
Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is
only if it's not true.
Sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this.
I like how they both said different words and then kept going like they both agreed on what they were talking about.
Why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one
You shouldn't, because he didn't do
that
that.
the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public.
Oh, do we have to bleep that out? I don't think we can say that. I don't think we can have that on the channel, can we? Don't say the name of God, the four-letter name of God out loud. First of all, you don't know how to pronounce it. No one knows how to pronounce it. Second of all, it's against like Jewish tradition to do that. You can't do that. You're just not supposed to do it. It's disrespectful. If you want, Jesus says like every disciple when he's fully trained will be like his teacher. Jesus never said the personal name of God out loud. We would know if he did. You can render it into Greek. You can make all the sounds in that name using Greek letters. So if Jesus was running around saying the name of God out loud, that someone would have wrote that down. You would be able to go into the Greek manuscripts and see some Greek letters that if you sounded out would sound like the name of God. He never did that. None of the apostles did that. You don't find it anywhere in the New Testament. So I think it's safe to assume that Jesus and the apostles followed the strictures of Jewish law as far as pronouncing the name of God. This guy should know better. Talking to an observant Jew, pronouncing the name of God, man. Tripping over the curb and falling off his skateboard. Don't like that.
An unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was
Yeah, that's a good question. I have some comments, but I want to wait and see what William Lane Craig says here.
I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context
He says that again.
before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous.
I don't think there's any such thing as a miracle taken in isolation. Not in Judaism. In Judaism, a miracle always happens for a reason. Generally, a miracle can only be performed by a prophet, and a miracle exists to authenticate the prophet's message. Miracles aren't just out there happening. They're performed by a person. And a miracle might have other purposes, like when Jesus heals the sick or when he feeds the 5,000. These, in addition to confirming his status as a prophet, in other words, someone with a genuine message from God, they also demonstrate God's character and reveal the values of the kingdom. In the kingdom, there won't be sick people will be healed. In the kingdom, there won't be hungry people will be fed. Those are kingdom values, and they reflect God's character. But the primary purpose of a miracle usually is to authenticate the message of the prophet. It's not the only thing that you need to be a genuine prophet. The test of the false prophet includes the case of the false prophet who does miracles, but the miracle, along with the other criteria, tells you that you're dealing with a genuine prophet. If someone claims to be a genuine prophet, Maimonides says you can make him do a miracle. You can tell him, put up or shut up, right? If he can't do a miracle or a sign or something, then you don't have to worry about anything he says. So yeah, Jesus coming back from the dead does authenticate his message because someone else didn't bring him back from the dead. He sort of brought himself back from the dead, or God personally brought him back from the dead. If some other prophet had come and brought Jesus back from the dead, it would authenticate that person's message. But yeah, Jesus, I would broadly speaking agree that Jesus coming back from the dead authenticates his message. I think we might just disagree a little bit here on exactly what that message was.
The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs.
It's given by the prophet. The prophet's job is to explain why he did the miracle. When Elijah told the rain not to fall for 3 years, he told everyone why, right? It wasn't a mystery.
And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So
sure.
One of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelation.
40 years is pretty good. It's hard to get closer to the time of an event than like 40 years after. When you're dealing with stuff that long ago, 40 years, man. It's a pretty short window. You've got eyewitnesses still at 40 years. We're quite blessed to have a window that short between the events and the writing down of the events.
For example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
They did it. They both said this two different words and then kept going like they had said the same word. They're both right. In order for a historical document to be reliable, it doesn't have to be contemporaneous and it doesn't have to be inerrant. So, I don't know. Point to both teams.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers.
Yeah.
Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
I don't know what that means. Every predisposition to the contrary. I would say like the Sadducees had every predisposition to the contrary because they didn't believe in the resurrection of the physical body. But the disciples did. The Pharisees did. The disciples, they all thought everyone was, at least the righteous were going to come back from the dead, So I don't know. Maybe they had every predisposition to believe that that wasn't going to happen until like the end of days. Maybe that's what he means. I don't know. They believed in the resurrection. They knew it could happen. I know the Old Testament. It happens in the Old Testament a few times.
The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies.
Yeah. I think he's probably talking about some of the formulations, like the creedal type or like hymn type formulations that we find in Paul's epistles, some of which we know are very early. And it looks like he's copying them from someone else, so they're even earlier than that. Yeah, he's right about that. Those are cool.
That individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory.
Very funny theories.
And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have this.
No, he spikes the ball at the 5-yard line. That's not what it means. We don't need to. If by revise, he means maybe add to a little bit. He's not just going to restore the kingdom. He's not just going to regather the exiles. He's not just going to rebuild the temple. He's not just going to, but he's also going to die and come back from the dead, and in doing so procure atonement for the sins of Israel. Sure, although, we're adding, I guess, in the sense that it seems that his disciples didn't expect that to happen. Like it's in Isaiah 53, like it's in the Old Testament, but it does seem that that it came as a surprise to his disciples. Even though he told them it was going to happen, they were still surprised by it and confused. So if by revise messianic expectations he means to add on a few things that were not expected, sure, but that's not what he means. He's talking about a definition of Messiah that excludes the definition of Messiah, which is the King of Israel, the King of the Jewish people, of a reconstituted kingdom of Israel. And the word Messiah comes from the Hebrew Mashiach, which means anointed. And it's the anointing that a king gets. It's the anointed king. That's what it means. Like, Messiah means anointed king of Israel. So, if he doesn't do that, what does the word even mean? You can't. He's got to do all those things, or he's not the Messiah. He will. He's going to come back and he's going to do all those things because he is the Messiah.
Historical argument back and forth.
Stop taking Israel and the Jewish people out of your theology. It makes it unbiblical.
Obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth. Simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s.
Yes.
And there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death.
So when I was living in Japan, I would get like advertisements from the Lubavitchers, like banner ads on websites in Japanese with a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So yeah, Ben is right here. I just always wondered who those advertisements were for. Who's the target audience?
That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So, especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference.
I'm sure that William Lane Craig will say this, but I want to say it first. Something that's true doesn't become less true because a lot of time goes by. Like, a reliable historical account doesn't become less reliable just because some time passed. Come on.
Ben, the important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present.
Yeah.
Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. Yeah. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
So let's talk for a second about sort of the necessity for Judeo-Christian revelation, because...
All right. Well, I think that's about as far as we need to go. I don't know who... I'm not going to declare a winner. Each one kind of owned the other at certain points. I think I really disagree with both of them, that Jesus came to totally subvert Jewish Messianic expectations. All that stuff's in the prophets. Read the whole book of Isaiah. Just sit down and read the whole book of Isaiah and come back and tell me that the Jewish Messiah is not going to reconstitute the kingdom of Israel and regather the exiles of the Jewish people. I mean, it's not, at times the prophets speak nebulously, but sometimes it's just really clear that God is definitely going to bring the Jewish people back to Israel and reconstitute the kingdom of Israel, rebuild the temple, reestablish the Sanhedrin. And it's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen whether we believe it's going to happen or not. So, I mean, I guess we don't have to be too worried that these guys are a little confused about it. But it does bother me a little bit that William Lane Craig, he he doesn't seem to understand the prophets to be saying what they're clearly saying, and that's, you know, it's very common in Christianity that people will cut all the stuff that's specifically about Israel and the Jewish people, and they'll just sort of like expertly excise it from their theology and reinterpret all those Old Testament passages as if they're talking about someone else or something else. And it's a shame. And I think it's getting better, but yeah. Well, if you want to see more reaction videos, like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know. Let us know what you think. We might do a lot more of these if you like them. We might do a lot more of them anyway. I don't know.